There we go. This recording helps people who are not able to be with us tonight tune into tonight's conversation and get to glean the wisdom and the exploration that we're going to go on. As I mentioned, I'm Rivera's son, and I work with Campaign Nonviolence, Pache Bene, as a trainer, and just recently as a social media coordinator and programs coordinator. And I've changed that to go on and do other things, but I'm really happy to spend this time with Ken tonight, celebrating his book, Nonviolent Lives, which many of you have read. Hopefully all of you have read, but no judgments if you haven't. It is published by Pache Bene Press, which is one of the leading nonviolence presses. And we're going to have a conversation tonight that is structured like this. We're going to let Ken say his opening remarks, and then we're going to go into a casual Q&A back and forth. So I hope you came with questions, and if questions come up for you midway through, please do take notes and make sure we get a chance to ask them. So for those of you who don't know Ken, he is a lifelong nonviolence advocate and activist. He has a long history of organizing, working on campaigns in the Bay Area around homelessness, working on anti-nuclear campaigns, organizing the Pledge of Resistance to help stop wars in Central and South America. And the list actually goes on, because I don't think Ken ever sleeps. I think he just lives and breathes active nonviolence. Most recently, more recently, he was the executive director of Pache Bene and helped to launch and initiate a program called Campaign Nonviolence, which helps to build a culture of active nonviolence in all of the dimensions and scopes of that word. And it's organized in all 50 states, and I think it's up to 17 countries now. And we consider books like Nonviolent Lives to be a part of building that culture, and conversations like we're having tonight a part of building the culture of active nonviolence, because culture is something that happens in all dimensions of our lives. So Ken, I wanted to just open up tonight's conversation by inviting you to speak a little bit about this book, Nonviolent Lives, where it came from, where the stories came from, what the process of writing was like, and maybe sharing just one or two of what your favorite stories are in the book, just to kick us off.
Thank you. And Rivera, thanks so much for your hosting tonight. I so appreciate all your work, your nonviolent life, and this opportunity to reflect on this process. When I think about this particular book, which I call my Chronicle of Gratitude, I'm casting my mind back to when my own experiment with truth, as Gandhi called his autobiography, began. And I joined the peace movement way back in the early days of the Reagan administration. That's in the last millennium. Because of the issues specifically in the first place around nuclear weapons and the arms race at that time. And then I spent 10 years working on trying to respond to and end US wars in Central America. I joined because of the issues, but I stayed because of the people. And I've always wanted to write a book that reflects on persons who have decided that they're going to go on the nonviolent life. Now, that doesn't mean they're super people or that they're nonviolent all the time, or that they are pure in heart even, but that they have committed themselves to challenging injustice and violence and doing it in a very creative kind of way. And that for me started in Northern California. And I fell in with a group which eventually called itself Spirit Affinity Group. And it included one of the persons in this book, Terry Messman, who now publishes Street Spirit in Oakland, working with homeless people who sell that on the streets, accounts of violence and injustice in the Bay Area, and then responding as a movement to the process of really trying to see the dignity of all, including homeless women and men and children. Terry was a fiery person. He had spent 6 months in federal prison, crossing the line at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, where the U.S. had intercontinental ballistic missiles on a hair trigger, ready to be launched at any moment, anywhere in the world. He had actually gone as a journalist, which is his vocation. And he was so moved and impressed by a local Lutheran minister who had on Easter morning decided to cross the line into the base, sitting there silent and alone, that Terry dropped his notebook and crossed the line and sat down next to this minister. Both of them got 6 months in federal prison. Terry had been released and then went directly to seminary, where I was a graduate student at the same place where he was getting his degree. And he was so filled with the spirit of what nonviolence can do. He had been trained in nonviolence. He had taken courses in nonviolence, but most importantly, he had acted his way into thinking and took action. And I will just tell this story that I was not sure about this nonviolence stuff. In fact, I've retrieved from my papers a paper I wrote in high school on civil disobedience, against civil disobedience. I felt civil disobedience was destroying our country. Now, this was at the height of the Vietnam War when I wrote this, but I was dead set against civil disobedience. So I didn't really have much to go on, but I was very moved by Terry and by what he was sharing and what I was learning at seminary about the dignity and well-being of all, not almost all. And so I wandered into a training where he was teaching about nonviolence, because they were about to go to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, about 40 miles east of Berkeley, where I was, that is next to Los Alamos, the second top secret nuclear facility in this country that's designed 50% of the US nuclear arsenal. So he was impassioned during the workshop, and I learned something about nonviolence trainings that day and the importance of them. And I decided by lunchtime, I'm going to do this. I didn't know what I was doing, but I decided this is speaking to me, and I'm going to engage in this nonviolent action. So I arrived on Monday with about 29 other folks. We sat down in a circle, and I noticed in the driveway of the facility, engaging in civil disobedience, there was no Terry. And I said, oh, this burns my bacon. What is it? He walks the walk, but not talks the talk. He talks the talk, but doesn't walk the walk. And I said, well, I'm not doing this for Terry. I'm doing it for the children of the world, and so on. So I sat down. I was dutifully arrested. I was taken to a holding cell. And about 45 minutes later, 2 police officers dragged Terry into our holding cell. And what Terry had done is that he had, as we were being arrested in sort of polite civil disobedience, he had bounded over the fence at this top secret nuclear facility, went up an administrative building, 7 stories, found a door open. There would be a congressional hearing about this in Washington. Why was that door left open? He walked in, he saw plans for nuclear weapons on the tables there. He began picking them up. He took them over to the door and threw them out down those 7 stories, went back and did the next time. After about 15 minutes, somebody looked up from her desk and said, "You're not supposed to be here, are you?" At which point, somebody with a gun burst in and got Terry down on the floor, and he was dragged through the halls saying the Lord's Prayer at the top of his lungs. And he told us this whole story. And everybody was very upset with him because he hadn't told them ahead of time that he was going to do this. I didn't know anything about movement culture at that time. I didn't know anything about solidarity or consensus or any of that. All I knew was I was enormously moved by what he had done. And for the next 2 or 3 years, we just did one beautiful, powerful, dramatic, nonviolent action after another. And I just say one more thing about that. How would we form our actions? Well, we wouldn't take it off the shelf the way some people did. You saw what Gandhi did or King did or somebody in the latest demonstration did. Let's do that. No, we would sit in a room, we would turn the lights off, we would light a candle, and we would wait till we got the gesture or the word or the drama. And out of that, we built some very powerful and beautiful actions together. And that was my training. And it led me to doing one nonviolent action after another, not just with Terry, but with a variety of movements going forward. What I learned is nonviolence is, as Dr. King calls it, the love that does justice. Sometimes we have love over here and justice over here. He smushes those together. It's a stand against injustice. It's using the most powerful language we have at our disposal, our own vulnerable bodies. And we can't do this by ourselves. If we try to change the world by ourselves, we'll be destroyed by it. So what we find out is that we are ordinary, cranky, beautiful, resilient people. We have more power than we think. We don't have all the answers. Nonviolence actually is not like violence. Violence is pretty sure it knows the answer. Nonviolence, no. It's an experiment, usually in the unknown. And I learned that not just with Spirit Affinity Group, but with the Pledge of Resistance, which some of us helped organize, including David Hartsoe, who I think I saw earlier on this call, and various movements over the last 30 years. And I believe in the power of these movements because I think it's rooted in our truest self and our deepest self. And so these stories that I wrote about, a lot of them I wrote on deadline for a website called wagingnonviolence.org. I highly recommend you check that website out, wagingnonviolence.org. It serves up everyday news stories on nonviolent actions that ordinary people like ourselves are taking all around the planet. There were some other stories as well that I wrote in addition to what I wrote for Waging Nonviolence that are in the book. But as I said, this was an opportunity to reflect on nonviolent lives, not as perfect people, but as people who are committed to seeing a different way between passivity on the one hand and violence on the other. So there were a lot of stories that moved me a great deal in here. I guess the first one I would just lift up is the first one in the book, which has to do with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who founded the United Farm Workers. And I was privileged to be part of a bicultural team that decided to honor Chavez after his death. He died at 66 years old. Amazing. He did so much in his life. At 66, he died. And some Franciscan friends of mine had worked very closely with him, and they said, let's honor him in some way. Should we make a statue? Should we create a medal? But cooler heads prevailed, and they said, well, why don't we offer workshops on Chavez's nonviolence and offer them, if we would, to Latino and Latina youth throughout California. So for about 4 or 5 years, I was part of that process. And we would simply open the space, talk a bit about Chavez's nonviolence, but then we would invite the young people to ask them, what violence have you faced in your life? And usually they're facing violence every day. They raise their hands, and we ask them to get in a group and form a drama, dramatize that violence. And they would present it to us. And then we would ask them, can you think about a nonviolent option or an alternative? And then they would go in their groups and they would work and come up usually with 4 or 5 different options. And we would spend the whole weekend playing those over and over again, asking them to go deeply into the nonviolence Chavez organized. It was very powerful. And at the end of those weekends, we would gather at Chavez's grave in the Tehachapi Mountains in Central California. And people who had been strikers with with Chavez in those movements for dignity for the migrant poor, would basically hand the baton to the young people and say, now it's your turn. And usually about 6 weeks after those events, we would try to get some of them together and ask, did the workshop make any difference? And every hand would go up. And people would say, oh, I was in the middle of a fight in the dish room at the restaurant where I work, and Chavez came to mind. And then I thought, what's an option here? And they began to tell us about these amazing ways of transforming this injustice and this violence. And I would just say these stories are about people who, in their own way, they're not perfect people, but they have so much to offer us. They are our trainers. And they're training us in how to take ordinary situations of violence and injustice and imagine an alternative. And that can be in my relationship with my mother, can be my relationship with my boss, my coworkers, or it can be in my relationship with my president or my culture. And that's what I've learned from these people that you see listed here. I guess the last story I'd just share. In 2009, Pace Bene, I work with Pace Bene Nonviolence Service. We're a peace and justice organization started in 1989. On our 20th anniversary, Pace Bene asked Vincent Harding to be our keynote speaker for our 20th anniversary. Vincent Harding was an activist during the civil rights movement. He was a historian, got his PhD at the University of Chicago, was a strategist for the movement, and wrote Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech, the first draft of it that he delivered April 4th, 1967, against the war in Vietnam. And Vincent came and we got to know him. What an amazing human being. And we started talking on the phone, like weekly. And he, without fail, always said, Brother Ken. He would call me and say, Brother Ken. I'd say, Brother Vincent. Relationship was everything for him. And finally, he called one day and said, I've been asked to teach at a university in Southern California called Soka University, a Buddhist university in Orange County, of all things. And he said, let's do this together. So we spent a week teaching a course for, if you can believe it, only 10 students. And Vincent brought out every meaningful story he had from the civil rights movement, and he had many. And the thing that most moved me one day was he was talking about Birmingham, the campaign in Birmingham. And he told how he was taking care of his 6-month-old daughter and could not get arrested with the others that particular morning. But he stayed as close to the action as he could, and just at the last moment veered away. And as he told the story, his eyes welled up with tears. He began weeping inconsolably. And I wondered what those tears were about. Was it that he couldn't do that action 50 years before? Was it because he was with his daughter, the most precious thing in his life? Was it because injustice and violence and racism continues today, 5 decades later? He didn't tell us exactly, but he told us so much. I just encourage all of us, find your Vincent Hardings, call them up, sit down with them in your town, in your state, in your nation, around your world. Make a list. That's what I did with the book of gratitude called Nonviolent Lives. Make a list of people that you want to talk with. And I was fortunate to have met the people in this book, but you have your own book within you. Go find these people, sit down with them, learn from them, share your experience with them, which is what I did with Vincent as well. And you won't regret it. And it'll be another important part of your own nonviolent life.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for sharing all of those stories. all those reflections. Wow. Let's just take a deep breath and absorb that for a moment. I want to turn the questions back to you guys and hear from you what your questions are about nonviolent lives, or for Ken specifically, or he's even able to answer questions about living nonviolently. Now, as we start this process, I just want to remind us to share the microphone time, and to think through our question beforehand, so that we can ask it in a way that leaves time for everyone to have a chance to ask the questions that they might have as well. And if you are someone like me who loves to ask tons and tons of questions, make sure that others have a chance to ask questions as well before you ask number 3, 4, 5 gazillion, as I do. And if you're someone who's shyer, who actually feels a bit hesitant to ask a question, maybe feel that this call has a little bit of open space in our lived nonviolence to make room for your question, no matter how silly it might feel to you or how simple or straightforward, that this is a call where we're going to actually make room for the questions and treat them with compassion and nonviolence. So I just want to open that invitation to both ends of the spectrum, no matter where you see yourself falling in terms of questions. Let's start with Miles, and then we'll go over to Ryan.
Ken, thank you very much for sharing your story. And I haven't read the book, but I will definitely be getting it and spending time with it. The story you described about being arrested reminds me of another book that I recently read, and I think the author's name is Zax. And it's about one individual's former nun, Sister Megan, and they went to what is the place in Tennessee where they Oak Ridge, and they cut their way through fencing, and like your friend, they end up right next to what's supposed to be the world's highest security location. So much for the security. And they also got arrested, and then they have a tremendous ordeal of going through the whole prosecution and sentencing. It's quite a heroic story. My question to you is, it seems almost that it's a loss, or the system wins when we end up being arrested. And what I'm working towards, I'm trying to elevate my own knowledge on democracy and being an active citizen, and leveraging the fact that both Canada and the United States are supposed to be democracies. So when people get arrested, to me, that's a failure of democracy. It should be the last thing that should have to happen. If we actually organize ourselves and our communities at the grassroots level to take charge and change our identity to one of we, the citizens, are the directors. All these politicians work for us. But because we're not very well organized, it's as though we're subservient to them. So I was just wondering if you've got any experience on generating active citizenship in community.
Well, thank you so much for that question. So you're walking along the road, you see a house on fire. You see there's a baby on the 3rd floor. You say, I'm going to go up and save that baby. You look at up at the baby. The flames are licking around the baby. I got to go save that baby. But then you also notice there's a big sign in front of the house that says, under no circumstance are you to trespass on this property. You look at the sign, you look at the baby, you look at the sign, you look at the baby, and you say, I got to save the baby. You race into the front door, you race up to the third floor, you catch the baby just in time, you get back down on the street level, you've saved the baby. The neighbors are all like they're applauding and clapping, and then all of a sudden handcuffs are put on your wrists. The police have arrived and they said, see, you see that sign? Under no circumstance are you to trespass. So they take you to court and you say, well, I will stipulate that I did break that particular statute, that law, but I was responding to a higher law. And in US law, I don't know Canadian law, but in US law, there actually is something called the necessity defense that says you have actually the right to break one law in defense of life or in defense of a higher law. Now, to me, simply put, that's the dynamic of civil disobedience. That we see injustice, we see violence, we see unjust laws, but we also see unjust conditions. And we need to respond to that. Now, what I say in nonviolence trainings is that we really need to do that, generally speaking, after we've exhausted all the remedies. That we do everything we can, like you're talking about. We organize ourselves. We write letters. We lobby. We do outreach to our representatives or to the media. We go to the courts even. And when we do that, we are exercising our rights that usually have been helped to be put in place because of previous movements, that you actually have those options. And sometimes it works. But if it doesn't work, most of the time it's because this is a very deeply entrenched policy or value. In the United States case that I was involved in many times, it was an implicit value, the right to intervene anywhere in the world. So that's hard to have a particular piece of legislation overturned. Now, those are the basics to me of civil disobedience, exhausting the remedies. Although there's another theory of civil disobedience that says if there's an emergency and you don't have the time to exhaust all the remedies, you also have the right to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. The one other thing I'd say about this, and then I want to get to your real question, is Gandhi felt that it is our, not just right, but obligation as human beings, every one of us, to not obey injustice or violence. That's actually built into our spirit as a human being, that's our job description. That we have the obligation, not just the right, but the obligation to disobey and not consent to, in fact, to withdraw our consent from injustice and violence. That's supposed to be our default situation. And even as a child, we know fairness and what's unequal and what's not fair. That's built into us. And he says that that's our job actually to do that. So it's not that it should be the exception. It should be actually the default to stand up against injustice. And I guess I would say that the reason it is at times important for our dissent, which can take many forms and doesn't have to be civil disobedience. And in fact, I have counseled many people at workshops and students and in movements. Don't do this unless you've gotten trained, unless you've really thought about this, unless you've thought about the consequences of it, unless you've really practiced, like Megan Rice, I think probably a year of preparation for that action you described. That's important. And if you have any hesitation, you shouldn't do it. That's what I keep saying to people, to myself and to others. So we have to really be ready to face the consequences of that and to make this stand. But why make the stand at all? Well, because it is one way we help communicate with our society that we're not in a utopia. We're not in a perfect world. We haven't arrived at that perfect democracy. I want that, what you described. I want that. I think we know that one way we get there is by building movements that take a stand. And we in the United States, I don't know how in Canada this is going, but in the United States, we're hearing some worrisome things about legislating against even simple protests, not even civil disobedience. I was just last night showing in one of my classes at DePaul University where I teach, I was showing a little video I just came across by accident of Cesar Chavez, who had given a talk in a university in Ohio. Very bad video quality, 1972 or something. And he's saying, in 1972, he's saying, and now the story is that all sorts of legislatures across the United States want to ban protest. And I thought, the more things change, the more things they remain the same. And we're facing that situation. So we could even be in a situation where people will say, well, why even protest? I mean, it's illegal to even protest. I think it's important to have this in our toolbox. It's not our only tool, and it should be only done conscientiously and with real preparation. But I think it's one of our best tools, one of our best tools. And I didn't know about that when I started out, but I learned about it and the importance of it. And I think amazing things can happen in it. And I would just share this little story. So at the same place, Livermore, a few years after what I described at the beginning, when Terry jumped the fence, a few years later, I was there. I decided I would try to symbolize my withdrawal of consent and not just go along when I was placed under arrest. And that's kind of challenging, but I thought, I'm just going to do this. And the police officer came by to arrest me. He said, you're under arrest unless you leave. And I said, I can't, by conscience, I can't leave. And besides, I actually feel like I can't move. I can't just cooperate with this particular action. I'm not saying that's true in every action, but this one I felt that way. And so he started yanking my hand. And he tried to pull me up. And his superior officer across the street just yelled over and said, don't fool around with that guy, just break his wrist. And I felt my wrist starting to go. And I don't know where this came from, but I kind of leaned up and whispered to him, you don't have to do that. And he kept torquing my wrist, and then he let go. And so I'm saying, wow, this guy just gave my wrist back to me. What can I do for him? And so I decided to get up and walk with him. We were over to the police van. And we're walking over there, and he stopped me halfway over, and he looked me straight in the eyes, and he said, thank you so much for telling me I didn't have to do that. And I said, oh, well, I was happy to. And he said, they brought somebody in last week to teach us how to break people's wrists. And I didn't want to do it. But my superior, my commanding officer, was telling me to do it. And you broke the spell by telling me I didn't have to do that. And we had this amazing conversation about his life and my life. Now, that's not going to happen in every situation. I'm white. It's less likely that I'm going to get my wrist broken than a person of color in that same situation, or even not even risking arrest. But I learned something about nonviolence that day. I learned something about that process of breaking the spell. And I actually think when we use our bodies in this way, when we put our bodies into these situations, something happens in the right brain of the persons around us and maybe even our society. You know, when Rosa Parks sits on that bus instead of going to the back of the bus, she is sitting there, but she's doing something really powerful. And we're still hearing the Big Bang from that amazing action. You know, scientists say we can still hear the Big Bang from 14 billion years ago, background radiation. We're still hearing the Big Bang from Rosa Parks. So I think it's a journey we all, you know, go on and we have to figure out for ourselves, but this is how I figured it out for myself.
Thank you, Ken. What an amazing set of responses. I want to call on Ryan Hall, who has a question. And I know, Ryan, you need to run. So
yep.
If you have to duck out before the end of the question, we are recording it for you. So you will get your answer. We
Thanks,
promise.
Yeah. I might have to take the answer off the air. Ken, one of the stories that I've heard you tell numerous times, and you wrote in the book, was your time with Daniel Berrigan. And you write about something he said in terms of we need to find somebody to pray with and to march with. And that phrase has kind of always stuck out to me, and especially in this time that we're now living in under Trump. And I guess I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit more about that story with Daniel Berrigan, what that meant to him, what it meant to you to say that phrase, and you know how you see it affecting the time we're living in.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Ryan, for all your work for nonviolent change. Very briefly, I was editing a book on nuclear weapons in 1980 and 81, and I went east to various think tanks and universities trying to get more information, and nobody had a way out. Nobody imagined there was an alternative to just more and more nuclear weapons or more conventional weapons and so on. So when I got to New York, I fished out of my pocket the phone number for Daniel Berrigan. For those who don't know, he was this rabble-rouser Catholic priest in the 1960s who converted to nonviolence and who spent the rest of his life engaged in very powerful nonviolent action. And he happened to be home that day, and he answered my call, and he invited me up to his apartment in the Upper Wilds of Manhattan. We spent 3 hours, and he just revealed to me his life energy and his vision. And at the end of it, I said, so Dan, I'm going back. I was an academic then. I'm going back to the West Coast. What can I do for you? And he said, don't do anything for me. Just find some people you can pray with and march with. And this little voice in my head goes, pray with them? Who? I'm an academic. You're the activist. I'm an academic. But that little phrase never went away. Find some people you can pray with and march with. And eventually I did. And I found my way into that little affinity group that we talked about earlier. I think it's more needed than ever. Find some people that you can really share deeply with and that you can march with and that you can act with and you can learn from together. We need that more than ever. I would love to see thousands and thousands of what we in those days called affinity groups, 5 to 15 people sitting together once a week, once every other week, sharing their lives and getting ready to first to understand what's happening in this time. We're in an unprecedented moment of violence and injustice, and it's just going to worsen. And the only thing that we have going for us is nonviolent change, nonviolent resistance, nonviolent lives shared together. That's all we have going for us. Nothing else, really. Everything can be poured into it, and it's really important, and it will make a difference. The women's marches in January made a difference. The marches that we organize are going to make a difference. The movement that we build, the community that we build, the culture of peace and nonviolence, we at Pace Bene, with Campaign Nonviolence, are trying to encourage all of us to be part of that culture and help build it. That comes out of our soul, and that comes out of sharing it with a few other cranky, ordinary, resilient people. So I just highly recommend, and if you need to hear this, find some people you can really share your life with and can march with. And that's what's helped me. People like Rivera and Ryan and David Hartsoe, who's on this call, who taught me so much about nonviolence. Together we can do something. But if we just sit in our living rooms and scream at the televisions, that won't be enough.
Thank you, Ken. That's a really beautiful testimony. And, one of the things that I like about Nonviolent Lives is the book is this connection between the stories that are very well known, like Dr. King and Gandhi, and the stories that are less well known, but much more familiar to our hearts, ordinary people. And the thing you really brought up for me was remembering how many of those ordinary people touched my life, like my father as a peace activist, an anti-war activist in Vietnam. And that so many of us who are in the younger years of the humans alive on Earth right now have been touched by the generations before us. So that really struck me as you spoke. Speaking of generational differences and someone who has a lot of time on skis, as my old ski instructor used to say, David Hartsoe, did I see you waving your hand over there?
Thank you, Ken. I really love your book, and I wish it could be the people in churches and schools and universities, communities all over the world could read it and feel inspired by these beautiful lives. So thank you for sharing these stories and for living part of this story yourself. So my question for you is, obviously for people, each person it's a little different, but what reading and hearing all these stories, what do you feel is kind of the bottom line of what has encouraged these people, what's helped them to keep going and to maintain a spirit of nonviolence in their lives and their work, and to sustain struggle, not giving up after the first or second try?
Thanks, David, and thanks for all your incredible life and work. And well, to me, I think in the end, it's that people have an experience of others, people who have faced violence and injustice very keenly, either in their own life or they see that in the lives of others. And they've decided that we're going to widen the circle of care beyond my nuclear family or beyond my workplace or my neighborhood. And we're just going to keep pushing that circle of care and compassion outwards. And that you find out eventually that we are all connected, that we are all one. As Gandhi said, difference without division. We're all different and we're all one. And that's a powerful, beautiful thing that you get to find out in this process. And so when I said, find some people you can share with and march with, well, that's some of the people you already know, but it's probably other people who are facing the brunt of what's coming down from this administration, for example. Muslims and immigrants and the poor and people without health care or whose health care is going to be snatched away. But also in our own soul, wherever we stand, we can be an ally, we can be a direct recipient of this violence. But then your larger question is, how do we not burn out? And actually, please reference David Hartsoe with this. I've known David now many years, and David, long before I met him, he was already living what I call in my book, because I wrote a chapter on his book, Waging Peace, I call an extraordinary, ordinary life. David always finds time to take that walk over to the park, or to have dinner with his family, to be present. And though I wish we lived closer, when we are together, we are being very ordinary together. And I've learned that from you, David. And I think it's really important to live the extraordinary, ordinary life, not be violent to ourselves in that way. But still, people burn out. So what keeps us from doing that? Well, I think it's that we take the time to go deeply into a vision of what we want to see. And it's not enough to be angry at the violence and injustice, especially what we're seeing daily now since January 20th. It's really about the vision of what we want and how do we experience it and live it. And I think we can do that in these affinity groups or in our organizations, or want to build a culture of peace and nonviolence that's human scale right here. So I think that's part of it. Other people, an ordinary life, and a vision that we're really trying to translate into reality. And I think you qualify for all of those, David, and probably all of us on the call at one level or another are doing this too. I've seen that in Rivera's life and Ryan, who was on earlier.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, David.
All right, I want to just open up the floor for some of you who haven't asked questions yet. I know some of you are just on telephone calling in, so be sure to, I'm going to unmute you all for just a second.
Watched it the other night. They were burning.
So I hear some background noise, but if you want to ask a question and you're on call, you need to speak up so we know that you have a question.
Spices used.
All right.
They
Dave Warren, I know you sent in some questions,
so
and
it was the next day that I decided.
I want to just check and make sure that you get a chance to ask them if you want to. No pressure if you don't, but if you do, make sure the technology is not hindering you from asking.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I don't know if you can see me, can you?
No, we can't see your wonderful face, but we can hear you very well, actually.
Okay, thank you. Well, my question was, if you're a small country, I was thinking of a country now, and you're invaded by a larger country, let's say Russia. Do the people in that smaller country have a right to defend themselves through physical means, meaning using violence, using guns to defend themselves against other people who are using guns? That's my question.
Thanks, Dave. So that's been an answer for thousands of years, that the response to an invasion is counter-violence. And there have been some really interesting experiments with this alternative. And that's what, in my own life, I've been hungry for the alternatives, because a lot of times what we've learned from trying to respond to an invasion, like you're laying out a larger force against a smaller force, that will leave a lot of death and destruction, and often the occupation will happen anyway. And we've seen some really interesting experiments in an alternative to that. So, as you may know, the story of Denmark in World War II, a conscious decision was made by the government not to try to repel Hitler's invasion of Denmark. So they ordered their soldiers not to try to repel violently the Third Reich as it was coming in. And it was taken over in 6 hours. And very few people died. And so, in fact, if you're interested in this, there's a really great video on this as part of a series called A Force More Powerful that played on PBS a few years ago. So what did they do? They decided they were going to navigate nonviolently with regard to the German occupiers. Unprecedented. Nothing like this had really happened before. And what's a little different from what we're thinking now is that they didn't have a Gandhi. I often think if Gandhi had been born in 1829 instead of 1869, maybe the history of Europe would be very different. But there was Gandhi hadn't even won yet in India. They didn't have nonviolence training, the kind of training that we've now begun to democratize and to spread everywhere. But they had an instinct that there's got to be a better way than passivity on the one hand and violence on the other. What seemed like passivity actually was a strategy of nonviolent resistance, even though they didn't know anything about that. And so that's what they did. And we now know there were so many aspects to that nonviolent resistance. There were some moments of sabotage that resistance, especially among the youth, sprung up. But actually that turned out not to be very helpful because it led to tightening the screws against the Danish people and people being executed. So what they found out was strikes worked. And they actually began to frustrate the war aims of the Germans, who had taken over Denmark for two reasons. They wanted the food that Denmark could produce for the rest of the German army, and they wanted them to be working on ships and tanks. And oddly enough, those ships never got built, and those tanks never got built. In fact, they had to be dragged back down to Germany. And maybe the greatest story from Denmark was the fact that the Jews, at one point, about 2 years into the occupation, the order came down from Hitler to round up all the Jews and send them off to death camps like Auschwitz. And here's what happened. The word was leaked. It was leaked to the underground, nonviolent grassroots movement. Now, who did the leaking? Well, quite likely, it absolutely was somebody highly placed within the German regime. Why did they leak? Well, we're all human beings. I think it's because the Danes had created a nonviolent atmosphere. And it made it more of a matter of conscience for this person who was not at the top of the leadership to actually leak at great risk to presumably himself. He could, if he had been found out, he could have been executed immediately. At great risk to himself, he leaked this. And literally within a day or two, 7,000 Jews were funneled out of the country into Sweden, which was neutral at that time. They had to cross a very difficult body of water that was patrolled by the German Navy. Only a few hundred Jews were rounded up and died. 7,000 were saved. So we have this amazing example, which I don't know about you, Dave. I didn't learn that in high school. And part of our job as nonviolent agents of change is to learn our history. And we're now learning about many stories like that. But we also know about a guy named Gene Sharp, who in 1973 published one of the great, you might even call it, Bibles of Nonviolence, the 3-volume Politics of Nonviolent Action. Very historical study of nonviolence. And Gene Sharp began to develop the theories and the mechanisms of civilian-based defense. He took your same problem and he said, how do we solve that problem? We're a large force, and he thought about it in terms of the Soviet Union versus, say, Latvia. Well, Latvia took Gene Sharp seriously and actually began to put in place a mechanism for civilian-based defense so that if the tanks did roll into Latvia from the Soviet Union, they would have a plan. And what's that plan? The plan is non-cooperation. That's what happened in Denmark. That's what would happen there. I think in the end, and there are many more concrete stories of this, actually, like Czechoslovakia in 1968, for example. But in the end, we're in this amazing time of experimenting with people power, so that you're absolutely right. We have the right to defend ourselves. The question is how we're going to do it. And we're in this time of this experimentation. And, I'll say, Dave, I think in the United States, we're going to need these techniques of non-cooperation, of finding that power and solidarity and banding together, because we may be ordered to do things, or other people may be ordered to do things. And then the question will be, well, how do we defend our communities? Or how do we defend Muslims? Or how do we defend Mexicans who are going to be deported, and so on? Our better bet is this kind of organized nonviolent action.
Great, thank you, Ken. Thanks for such a thorough reply to that, and also the invitation to think of it as an ongoing experiment. We are at the top of the hour, but I want to just invite one more question from Miles before we end tonight. And I thank everyone for joining us and for hanging on for this last question, because we're getting to hear some real pearls of wisdom from Ken tonight. So Miles, let's hear for your question, and if we can do it in a succinct way, then we can also honor people's time commitments they might have now.
Ken, you talked about the affinity group as being really important, and it reminds me of some notes I have from a fellow named Bill Gross, who said of all the companies that he started, the idea is actually number 3 on the list for success. Like, you have a great idea, but if you don't have a great team to begin with, your chances of success, even if you've got the world's best mousetrap, are not going to be that great. I think the timing is number 1 on his list, and there's no arguing. I don't think the timing to get on with peace and nonviolence is definitely now. My concern is I'm wanting to reach out to people in my community to create this affinity group. And one of the things that struck me was this fabulous pledge that your organization has, and John Deere used it before taking people on a march at that Los Alamos nuclear laboratory.
Yes.
And is that something that I could solicit from your organization to create a contract with people in my community?
Of course. It's an opportunity for people to really look into their own soul. Where do they want to go? And commit themselves to a journey, is what it really is. And, I'm an old pledge guy, with the Pledge of Resistance. 100,000 people took the Pledge of Resistance, and this was before the internet in 1984, where we committed ourselves to take action if the U.S. escalated its military intervention in Central America. And it really worked. And we married that with training. So we were up to 4 nonviolence trainings a week in the place where I was organizing the Pledge of Resistance, because it's not enough to take the pledge. It's like, well, or I need some training even before I take the pledge, because it really gets us prepared and ready. And here's the great thing, Miles, we're going on a journey. This is a pilgrimage now. This is a sacred journey. And there are a lot of challenges, and it's going to be difficult, but it's also incredibly rewarding and powerful to find one another and to do this kind of thing together. Pledge helps us do that. Yeah.
Thank you, Ken. I meant to post the link to that in the comment thread, but I don't have it handy. But you can find it on www.campaignonviolence.org. Just by clicking on that link, you'll find it on the top menu bar. And the text is adaptable, it's versatile, and you can use it in your communities, as many thousands of people already have. And the link that I accidentally posted, but maybe that's a little Freudian accidental slip there, is the donations link for Campaign Nonviolence and Pace Bene. If you've enjoyed tonight's conversation, if you would love to support the work of this organization, that's where to do it. And it is very gratefully received, and it does really help us continue to do these kind of great events and the broader work that happens all throughout the country and around the world. And we know that we are actually reaching millions of people each year, and we have 70,000 active participants in the Week of Actions that we hold in September. So please do take a moment, if you're not familiar with the work of Pace Bene Campaign Nonviolence, to check out what's going on. It's very exciting, very much needed, and very helpful for the communities that it's organizing in. I want to thank all of you guys for joining us. For those who listened and who participated with that active listening, we really appreciate that and we honor that. And for those who brought their questions to the table today. And I want to especially thank Ken Butigan for showing up and sharing his personal journey as well as his experience writing the book. Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yes, thank you, Rivera, and thank you for your amazing work and creativity. And for those who don't know, she just published a great novel called The Way Between, which is going to give Harry Potter a run for Harry's money. It's a nonviolent tour de force.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you all once again. Thank you for being a part of this growing culture of active nonviolence. I know that tonight we have actually embodied the work that needs to be done, and I know for many of us, we live and breathe it. So thank you for starting the journey with us, and have a wonderful evening. I'm going to open up the mics, and you can all say hello and goodbye to each other.
Well, thank you
very
all.
much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
I'd like to say thanks.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to say thanks to Ken. I really enjoyed especially chapter 19. I got to be a close classmate of Leontine Kelly in 1973. She and I were living in Richmond, Virginia. It's not a really safe town for Black people to be in. And we were both studying the Greek language to enter ministry that fall at a seminary in Richmond. And I did not know these particular facets about her life. She was such a humble lady. And she inspired me by so many different things of her makeup and her ministry. And I just wanted to thank you for including that in the book. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. And thanks for sharing about that. And Leontine was the best. Really glad I could